Carriers are already implementing NFV and SDN technologies, and Andrew Coward, Vice President of Service Provider Strategy at Brocade, is here to tell us how they are keeping pace with the evolution of virtual networking. Hello, good to see you.
Hello, good to see you.
The carrier and service provider space is already implementing NFV technologies as their networks become software defined. But what stakeholders are involved in making this shift happen, and how much of the lift is on the carrier side?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because the entire ecosystem of our industry is essentially shifting. And with that, the power balance of who gets to decide how all these elements of the different constituents come together. Let me give you some examples. For the first time, open source is playing a much more important role in the entire ecosystem. So things like OpenStack, OpenDaylight, OPNFV, these become the foundation of the ecosystem, which allows many new players to come into the market and compete with some of the traditional carrier vendors. And the reason that's interesting is it obviously creates choice, but it also enables the service providers, or forces the service providers to actually do a lot more work to provide a level of integration that perhaps they haven't done before. Now, here's the challenge. For the largest service providers, they have the teams, they have the people, and they have the will to kind of make this happen. And we've certainly seen that in Asia, in Europe, and here in the US. For the smaller service providers, they were kind of used to hitting an easy button, and when they hit the easy button would call a vendor up and say, "Give me the whole thing end to end." So for those service providers, having to provide or download or use open source software in combination with a whole choice of different elements becomes very daunting. And so one of the opportunities and challenges for companies like Brocade and for others in the industry is how do we give those folks the easy button too, so they can take advantage of this technology and kind of deliver these end-to-end solutions but still have choice. And by the way, choice in this means that you should be able to swap out any of the components and not worry about how the management of that component is going to be affected, because you can't do that today. So if we go through this transformation correctly, and it's strange for a vendor to say this, but you should be able to swap out Brocade or any of the other vendors that are in there simply because you want to do something different. And obviously, we then fight for the value for the individual components that go into the network. So our performance in our software routing, or the value that we provide through support for the open source projects we contribute to.
You said once that it's not enough for carriers to have Lego blocks, but they need the instructions to go with them. Were you referring to software Legos and the instructions to show how to provision them for the carrier?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I'm allowed to say Lego blocks, but we'll use it for this interview.
We'll use it.
But I think one of the interesting pieces is if you go buy a Lego set, and I've done this for my son, and I'm sure everybody has done it at some point, there's a great set of instructions that come with that. And if you don't have the instructions, then it becomes very difficult to build anything of complexity. And I think a lot of service providers kind of feel the same way. They've got all these Lego bricks laid out, different colors, different sizes, and putting that together themselves is kind of hard. So where's the instruction set? And so for companies like Brocade, part of our job is to not just provide some of the Lego bricks, but to provide the instruction set that will enable you to build something simple, or all the way up to the Millennium Falcon or whatever it is that you're trying to build, and do that in a way that gives you choice through the whole process.
How much of the lift to implement SDN technologies for carriers falls on your shoulders, and how much is your part? For example, Brocade can't do it all. The carrier has to make significant steps towards realizing their software-defined networks.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. As Brocade, where we excel is in delivering key components of the ecosystem. So specifically software networking, the Vyatta products that we have that drive very high performance for software routing, switching, firewall, VPN, all those kinds of services. That's where we'll excel. We'll also excel through contributions to the open source community into things like Open Daylight and providing distributions for initiatives like that. But obviously those are kind of point pieces. So one of the things that we found is that the partner landscape also has to come together, and we have to be in a position where we can either provide entirety or more likely to help our customers bring in partners that are connected to that. So let me give an example. If we're building services where we're putting a virtual CPU, so products that go out to customer sites, what are those products? Because they're probably not going to come from Brocade from a physical perspective, but they'll likely come from us from a software perspective, or at least we'd like them to. So then the ecosystem suggests that there's going to be 4 or 5 different vendors, be they the traditional computer manufacturers, HP, Dell, companies like Ciena, Overture, Corian. There's a lot of choice that will take place there. So our job is to excel in enabling those partners to deliver those component pieces where we directly wouldn't play.
How is Open Daylight shaping the network sector?
Yeah, so Open Daylight's been a really interesting project because in this kind of shift to software networking, one of the things that we've kind of been missing is what I would term a universal translator. That's a strange thing to say, but if you think about it, there's lots of existing products in the network. Some people would say legacy products. Some vendors would disagree with that assertion. But the fact is that if we want to have something that's replaceable, we've first got to have a common way of describing how we configure all the network elements, regardless of which vendor they come from. And so the idea of a universal translator says that I can provide standard business logic rules that say this is how I want to configure a firewall or a router or an MPLS service, and have them pushed out regardless of what that end product is. And so while that might be the existing legacy product today, you should be able to replace that product with a piece of software later, but then not change the business logic, not change the billing, not changing anything else that's northbound of that. And so Open Daylight's job, or at least one of its early jobs, is to provide that universal translator, or Babelfish, if you like, so that anything that comes from the instructions from the OSS/BSS system, or indeed OpenStack, can be translated into this kind of from this universal business language of Yang and so on into the specific instructions for each individual network component. And that's the magic, and that's why it's getting traction, because it enables kind of joining the old world to the new world.
How do NFV test labs allow network operators to change their perspectives regarding what is possible with software-driven networking?
Yeah, I think one of the early assumptions with NFV was it wouldn't deliver the same performance that traditional network products, routers and switches, firewalls and so on, could deliver. And we spent a lot of time with customers in labs proving that not to be the case. Because essentially the cost point kind of flip, if you like, is when you can deliver standard compute platforms, Intel type servers, x86 servers, with software and outperform or outcompete existing pieces of hardware. And at that moment, feature set being equal, you kind of have a point where it's much easier to do things in standard hardware versus proprietary hardware. And that's one of the big changes that really we're going through. And we saw this in server architectures for general compute. And now we're seeing this in networking really take place. So for Brocade's job in this has really been to drive performance through benchmark testing, through our work with Intel, through our work with customers. So every time we go into a lab, we can put a legacy product together with a standard Intel server and say, well, this is 4 or 5 times cheaper, and it has the same performance. And that becomes the benchmark that says, okay, well, I know that if I make this investment, it's going to be a lot cheaper for me to do this. But I must say that the capital outlay is only the beginning of this story, and the agility that comes from moving to a virtualized environment is really the hot button that carriers get to, because they realize, well, I've got to make this new investment in capital. It's not like I don't stop spending money. I've got operational changes to make, but I get this agility so that I can have general compute. If I want to scale up my firewalls, my load balancing, then you kind of get to that point because I just use general compute. I don't have to use something specialized. And so by bringing products into the lab that demonstrate those very points, we're able to kind of win through the conversation.
Is there anything else about Brocade that you'd like to share with us today that I haven't covered in these questions?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of initiatives that kind of summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about, and the kind of industry's tagged onto this, is what's been termed the new IP. And people think the new IP, is that like IPv8? Is it some kind of new version of IP that we haven't heard about? Well, in this context, it's more about using IP as an innovation platform. And what I mean by that, to the points about agility, being able to take advantage of SDN, which creates automation, delivers an ability to make things happen very quickly, and creates the agility, together with NFV, which provides the virtualization and the ability to scale out these services. You bring those two things together, and you've got a very unique and differentiated platform. And that really represents what the industry is talking about when they say new IP. So for us then, as Brocade, kind of working through the mantra of what that new IP then represents, means that we've got a common framework with which to share the story on one part, and then bring the technology behind that to deliver against that promise.
Thank you for talking about Brocade with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.